Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in economics here at the Open University, and I'm contributing to the organization of the International Development Innovation Seminar Series. We have, this is the second seminar of the year. We have an exciting program, and I can share more detail with you later after the seminar. But in the meantime, today we're super excited to have with us an exciting panel and a bunch of speakers to present and launch the new book of Les Levidow, who is a senior research fellow at the Open University based in DPP in the Development Policy and Practice Department here at the Open University. And we also have two discussants with us. Sam Mason, who's a Sustainability and Climate Change Officer for Public and Commercial Services, and Helena Paul, who is a co-director at EcoNexus. So we are gonna have a structured presentation first by Les, who's gonna give us an introduction of his new book, and then we'll have the two discussants contributing to enrich the discussion that before we open the floor to the participants for a Q&A. Before we're starting, I just wanted to say that the video is being recorded and it will be available for playback on our website and I think YouTube channel as well. So if people don't want to be featured, they can ask questions in the Q&A session and has to remain anonymous in the chat box. You are also automatically muted at the moment so to avoid noises, background noises during the presentations. But please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. And also please follow us on Twitter at intdev_OU so that you can get updates about our activities, publication, and reports. So without further ado, I think Les is ready to start. I think Craig has also his slides, so I'm gonna mute myself and put my camera off so that we enjoy the presentation. Thank you again, everybody, for joining, for those who joined last minute, and thank you for the speaker and discussant. Yes, Les, are you ready?
Yes, do we have the PowerPoint file there?
Yeah. Thank you.
Just bear with me one moment.
Yes, with the previous slide is the title page, Beyond Climate Fixes from Public Controversy to System Change, which is the name of the book. So move on. Western states have made strong commitments to decarbonize their economies, but progress has been deceptive, slow, and/or patchy, especially in the past decade. We go back to the 90s, early decarbonization happened for other reasons, that is, by deindustrializing economies, outsourcing emissions abroad, and which are not officially counted at home when high carbon products are imported back, and by replacing some coal with natural gas. Renewable energy has risen, but this has mainly supplemented fossil fuels because total energy usage has risen more. Major energy producers often prioritize fossil fuels simply because they are more profitable than renewable energy, even though the latter is cheaper, or would be cheaper for consumers if the price were set to the cost production, which is not the case. New renewable energy sources face long delays in getting connected to the grid, sometimes up to 15 years. Many high-carbon activities pay for carbon offsetting through dubious carbon credits, and more on that later. Industrial sectors emphasize future technologies, which will supposedly facilitate decarbonization, as reasons for delay. So how to diagnose the fundamental problem for decarbonization being deceptive, slow, or patchy? Next. Well, the system. The climate justice movement has highlighted the political economic system perpetuating greenhouse gas emissions alongside social injustices, as expressed in the now famous slogan, system change, not climate change. And the conflict over the system can be expressed by the quotes in the next slide. As Greta said a few years ago to a climate summit, the climate and ecological crisis cannot be solved without system change, a slogan which goes back nearly 2 decades but has become more prominent. Compare this with these two other people who personify a rival agenda, from Lord Nicholas Stern, who is famous for his reports urging decarbonization, but less famous for his important role in promoting carbon markets as crucial for the solution. He said, we should have a very open-minded attitude to technology and let the markets decide which to choose. And he meant in particular carbon markets as stimulating low-carbon technologies. And then John Kerry, US government's climate envoy, said, I'm told by some scientists that 50% of the reductions we have to make by 2050 are going to come from technologies we don't yet have. Notice the promissory tone. Okay, next. So to illuminate those rival agendas, my book poses these questions. How do dominant policy frameworks promote market-type incentives, supposedly to generate technological fixes for environmental problems? How do those fixes construct the public? How do opponents contest those fixes, stimulate public controversy, and so open up different societal futures? How do those agendas attempt to build a social agency for alternative solutions? And in those ways, how do rival solutions promote divergent societal futures, serving either system change or continuity? Now, next. Well, here, the central concept for answering those questions is techno-market framework, which relates to socio-technical imaginaries. Since the 1990s, eco-modernist frameworks have attributed environmental problems to inefficient resource usage, whose remedy, therefore, lies in eco-efficient techno-innovation. This policy aims to strengthen economic competitiveness. It frames the nation as an economic space, as a basis to gain intellectual property or technology export, more efficient production, and so on. Economic imaginaries frame territories as competitive units in the economic fight with foreign rivals. For example, even beyond nations, Europe, the European Union, becomes a single political economic competitive space facing a common external threat. This illustrates how an economic imaginary helps to build political alliances and mobilizes resources. Okay, next. Economic imaginaries have merged with neoliberal environmentalism, promoting market-type incentives such as carbon trading as the essential means to generate green low-carbon innovation. Techno-market neoliberal frameworks justify institutional change towards generating new markets. This illustrates socio-technical imaginaries, which were defined by their original theorists as collectively imagined forms of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific or technological projects. Socio-technical imaginaries frame what constitutes the public good or a good life. Next. This dominant framework displaces the state's responsibility elsewhere, for example, to financial instruments, to R&D, and anonymous market forces. Priority has been given to innovations which suit a techno-market agenda more than those dependent on direct state investment and responsibility. Techno-market frameworks promote competition over cooperation, preempt alternative futures, and thus undermine democratic accountability. Techno-market fixes dominate the policy frameworks of the European Union and the United Nations, especially its climate convention. Such frameworks have helped to delay or slow decarbonization, facilitating system continuity while maintaining a passive public which awaits these techno-solutions. Such roles have provoked opponents from diverse standpoints, which have sometimes become aligned in common protest. And this protest has stimulated controversy and alternative solutions, opening up public debate. The next. For climate fixes, advocates have cited expert judgments to justify their techno-optimistic promises and innovation priorities. However, these expert claims have been undermined by citizen expert networks. These can be understood as mobilized counterpublics, integrating diverse knowledges and aligning diverse critical frames as theorized by David Hess and his colleagues. Such efforts have contested the official expertise, for example, for exaggerating environmental benefits of the fix, downplaying its risks, concealing inequities, privileging dominant economic interests, and so perpetuating the causes of environmental problems. So they counterpose alternative futures, drawing on a rival socio-technical imaginary. As the original theorist said, multiple imaginaries can coexist within a society. Such contests generate rival future visions and imaginaries. I'll move on. Facing greater opposition, policy elites have sometimes tightened or broadened the environmental criteria, and these more stringent criteria have complicated the evidence necessary to justify fixes as beneficial, sometimes impeding them. So I just give two examples here. So one is carbon credits as satirized, chasing carbon unicorns in this report. Yeah, move on. Under the Kyoto Protocol, carbon credit schemes have been central to supposed plans for decarbonization. Hard carbon polluters have been cheaply buying the right to pollute, thus protecting their production systems and so system continuity. Carbon credit schemes have facilitated more land enclosures, including land grabs, social disruption, and plunder of the global south. All these schemes depend on false accounting, especially through assumptions about counterfactual scenarios, that is, what supposedly would have happened, generally something very bad, if it weren't for the scheme avoiding those bad scenarios. These harms and deceptions have attracted greater global opposition, so carbon credits have been increasingly discredited as greenwashing. And move on. As satirized in this cartoon from Kathy Wilcox, the fossil fuel companies still continue their high carbon production methods. Now, here's the second example. Carbon capture and storage has carried a promise to decarbonize fossil fuels into low carbon fuels, while securely storing the carbon, even accruing carbon credits. This techno-optimistic promise has been central to so-called decarbonization roadmaps, necessitating CCS in order to reduce the cost of decarbonization, especially through hydrogen fuel. This can be understood as a socio-technical imaginary, somehow reconciling fossil fuels with decarbonization. It has been promoted by major institutions, the European Commission, the IPCC, the UK's Committee on Climate Change. They have all justified delay in decarbonization alongside large budgets for R&D towards CCS pending its technological improvements. In the UK, the CCS agenda has gained support through a cross-class alliance between the natural gas industry and trade unions in hard carbon sectors, calling themselves the energy unions, as if they have a policy monopoly. And this features in particular Unite the Union prospect in the GMB. This alliance has imagined CCS generating zero-carbon hydrogen for heating everyone's homes, alongside secure employment and export opportunities. The Union Jack symbolizes a common national interest while concealing workers' subordination to their bosses, as shown in the next slide. Here's publicity from that alliance. Trade union bosses back UK hydrogen, but jobs boom. Okay, next. The CCS has been losing credibility for several reasons. There's been a long-time failure of the R&D efforts. The success lies mainly in enhanced oil recovery, whereby it helps to extract oil in places where otherwise it would be more difficult. Expert reports on its technical, economic, and feasibility, and critiques of its political role in delaying decarbonization. The Climate Justice Coalition, this is especially in the run-up to the COP in Glasgow, oppose such false solutions. The UK's Campaign on Climate Change set up a trade union group whose briefings include greenwashing fossil fuels with CCS. In Unite the Union, perhaps the most prominent proponent of this cross-class alliance, some members have opposed the leadership's alliance with the natural gas industry. Now, these are just two brief examples of fixes and how they are potentially being discredited. Next, I go on to environmental fixes, which attracted mass opposition. And these would be corresponding to 3 chapters in the book. So the first case, genetically modified, also known as transgenic crops, and their next agenda are climate smart crops. The original controversy over GM began before hardly many people really knew about it. This is in the 90s, before the products exist. NGOs launched a campaign against patents on life with the slogan "criminalize biopiracy" in relation to the EU Patents Directive, which is going to extend property rights to seeds derived from this technique. So move on. And that indicates the techno-market aspect, which was a key driver of the technology. Now, in the 1990s, EU promoted GM crops as a market-based means to overcome environmental problems of intensive agriculture. The policy meant to create new markets, for example, for patents and agri-inputs, thus making the EU economy more competitive, a central concept in the policy for innovation. Agri-biotech critics rejected this rationale for imposing patents on life, which they called biopiracy, and perpetuating the systemic problems of industrial agriculture. A broad opposition movement combined diverse critical frames, for example, consumer choice, environmental protection, industrial agriculture, as threats being intensified by this technological agenda. Their mass opposition eventually blocked an EU market for GM products. Opponents counterposed quality agricultures and promoted by GM-free regions. Eventually, agroecological systems became a counter-hegemonic alternative. These depend on farmers' grassroots innovation for both using and conserving biodiversity as a resource commons. But the industry didn't accept defeat. Around 2014, the agri-biotech lobby sought to relaunch their fix as so-called climate-smart agriculture, which would absorb greenhouse gas emissions into the soil and so accrue carbon credits. Opponents again built a political alliance opposing corporate smart greenwash, as they called it, and counterposing ecological methods, which make agriculture more resilient, cool the planet, and feed the people. So now we move on to the key slogan, sustainable peasants agriculture, also known as agroecological methods, cools down the earth, and feeds the people. So next, second case, biofuels, which had been around for a long time, became the focus of a policy agenda to create a statutory mandate for a minimum percentage of biofuels which must be contained within transport fuel. So that provoked a global debate in 2007 onwards on food versus fuel in priorities for land use threatening the land use for people's food needs. And in Brazil, in particular, whose government imposed such a mandate, the landless workers movement raised the slogan, "Bioethanol means slave labor and expensive food," as you see in the protest on the right at a biofuels convention. And move on. In 2009, the Renewable Energy Directive said that transport fuel must contain a rising percentage of renewable sources. And the only foreseeable one in the near future was going to be biofuels, which at the same time symbolized a future European bioeconomy. The initial biofuels market supposedly would stimulate R&D towards second generation and advanced biofuels, which could use non-edible crops and then avoid or overcome any conflict with food needs. This was meant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the EU's rising transport flows, which themselves were not questioned. They were accommodated by the directive. So it provided an alibi for normalizing those rising transport flows and for postponing tighter standards for fuel efficiency, especially for Germany's luxury cars. As a techno-market fix, the mandatory biofuel targets expanded the market for the feedstocks, thus intensifying global resource extraction and land use rivalry between food needs on the one hand, and fuel, well, also animal feed, which was already a conflict food needs. Commodity crop production causes systemic harm, which is now being worsened by biofuels. These were degrading or plundering supposedly marginal land, another key concept, thanks to Peter Mandelson in his role as an EU commissioner. Opponents promoted alternative agendas on the various issues. For example, food sovereignty versus land use for biofuels and commodity markets, biodiversity conservation, stricter fuel standards, electric vehicles as an explicit mandate rather than simply waiting, and greater public transport. However, the EU maintained these and increased the percentage required for biofuels on the main argument that these incentives were necessary to create an investment climate for the bioeconomy, note the use of the word environment. Despite those promises to avoid food and crops and the edible parts, second generation biofuels had still not materialized a decade later. So the EU targets continue to generate a significant biofuels market, incentivizing the most harmful feedstock, because they were the highest energy content, for at least another decade, and to some extent still now. We'll move on. The the third case, waste to energy incineration fixes. So here's an opposition report from the network Zero Waste Europe, which has opposed incineration of waste, especially municipal solid waste, for the past decade or two, and emphasized the greenhouse gas emissions. The EU policy framework has required member states to reduce landfill by managing waste as a resource, thus reducing greenhouse gas emissions from methane. Local authorities have undergone pressure to outsource waste management through private sector contracts, thus resulting in waste-to-energy incineration plants, especially in the UK over the past decade. Techno-scientific innovation was meant to decentralize material flows, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and enhance waste recovery through energy production that is supposedly renewable energy, which would substitute for fossil fuels. To achieve these aims, the UK devised a techno-market fix, whereby market competition was meant to stimulate novel advanced thermal treatments, ATTs, which would turn waste into high-value products, perhaps even transport fuel, thus overcoming the limits of incinerators. However, ATTs never fulfilled this promise, Instead, the ATTs extended the problems of normal incinerators, imposed environmental nuisances, especially in lower income areas, and so still provoked opposition, despite their claim to go beyond incineration. Opponents blamed all those facilities, regardless of their name, for feeding the beast, a common slogan in the campaigns, and thus perpetuating waste production. They denounced all thermal treatments as incineration for wasting resources that would have better uses for waste recovery. Protesters blocked at least 70 new incineration plants over the past decade. As an overarching socio-technical imaginary, opponents have counterposed a circular economy, locally based production consumption circuits with less waste generation, more effective waste collection. In particular, they have advocated materials recovery facilities, which would value and recycle waste, thereby maximizing the recovery, rather than incinerating it all, alongside renewable energy production addressing fuel poverty. And some anti-incineration groups have been building political alliances for locally accountable and beneficial alternatives, thus deterring additional incinerators, especially as local authority take note of the successful campaigns elsewhere. So this conflict continues now over more proposals for extra incinerators. Now move to an overview about these conflicts over techno-market fixes. Here are some general patterns. Each fix rests on a claim for innovations, remedying deficiencies of previous technology, whether it's crops or fossil fuels and the internal combustion engine or incinerators. And they give a futuristic name to the supposedly better or advanced technology that will avoid those problems, such as second generation biofuels or advanced thermal treatments. Such innovation was meant to come from market type incentives, thus justifying more market competition as a societal model. Thus, it promotes system continuity in several senses. It provides an alibi for continuing high carbon production and continues the political economic system, which proposes new markets as the solution to any environmental problem. In response, critics have generated controversy. Counterpublics have undermined these techno-optimistic assumptions of the official expertise underlying these fixes and have organized public opposition, thus disrupting the fix to some extent. They put techno-market fixes onto the defensive, resulting in more stringent evaluation criteria, and so potential opportunities to block or restrict the fix. This disruption has created an opportunity for generating alternative solutions and raising support for the ones already available. I'll move on. In each controversy, rival agendas have promoted their own narrative of progress towards a feasible, desirable future, as theorized by the concept socio-technical imaginary. Some alternatives involve grassroots innovation, whereby a socially inclusive process involves users in the design, especially in agroecological systems, in the food sovereignty vision, extending agroecology, and in some materials recovery facilities as proposed by anti-incineration groups. Some alternatives promote eco-localization, that is, localizing production consumption patterns by using locally available natural and human resources. This agenda also builds a commons in knowledge and resources while resisting their private appropriation. What I call a transformative mobilization would need to combine several elements. counterpublics, eco-localization imaginaries, and grassroots innovation. Such transformative mobilization can contest dominant production systems and mobilize resources for alternatives beyond climate fixes. This effort gives practical meaning to the slogan, system change, not climate change. So I conclude there with the picture on the cover of the book. So thanks for listening, and thanks
Thank you,
for our
Les.
two discussants for agreeing to do
Thank you, Les.
commentaries. Right?
Yes, thank you, Les, for your insightful presentation and very policy oriented in a way. We now give the floor, as you announced, to the two discussants. We will start, I think, with Helena, who has some slides from what I know.
I'm so sorry, but I was not the next speaker.
Okay, so no problem. So we'll go with Sam first. Is that okay, Sam? I know
Yes.
you're a bit ill, so don't worry. We'll completely understand if you will cough sometimes. But yeah, Sam. So I'll try to stay within like the 5-10 minutes maximum. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lorena, and thank you, Les, for that presentation and the opportunity to respond with a few comments. Obviously, as a trade unionist and somebody who's working in the policy space around climate change, sustainability, and the just transition narrative, and also a member of the Climate Justice Coalition trade union caucus as well. So I just wanted to come in with a few points, mainly which was really focusing on the cross-class alliances, which you've highlighted around the green techno fixes. And I think one of the questions which you pose is how do opponents contest those fixes? Because at least, as I know Les well knows, within the trade union movement, we have some very split positions over the direction, to put it in broad terms, of the so-called just transition process and what that decarbonisation process of the economy should look like, and how that should happen as well. I just, on a more kind of flippant side, it just struck me this morning, for those who may not have seen it, the headline in the City AM free newspaper, which obviously focuses more on finance things, it had a quote saying that more Brits believe in aliens than they do in ESG, so environmental, social and governance, which is obviously the corporate greenwashing of trying to say what they're doing in terms of climate change and environmental issues. And I thought that was sort of quite perceptive in terms of, I mean, I haven't read the actual report, there is a report which this relates to, but in terms of the skepticism that there is around generally about what's happening with decarbonisation strategies above all. And I think the 2 points as well to make, I mean, obviously as a trade union, we're concerned with jobs, whether that's for members in PCS or members in other unions, or those workers who are not in what we called organised labour, i.e. therefore as part of a trade union, although I hesitate to say that workers who are not in trade unions are not necessarily unorganised, because lots of workers who are not able to get through the restrictions of the anti-trade union laws doesn't necessarily mean they're not collectivizing in some ways, and particularly obviously around those key issues that they face in their jobs. But I think two things we have when we have these debates within the trade unions is, one is obviously about technological solutions to the decarbonisation processes underway, and namely around energy transition, and energy after all is at the heart of everything that we do, so we have to recognise that, and that is why we focus on it quite a lot. But also in terms of political economy discussions as well. Now, for my union, it's always been very clear that we've talked about a just transformative transition rather than only a just transition, because this isn't about a green capitalist job swap between what people are doing now and what they may be doing in the future. This is to recognise the inherent inequality in the current capitalist system, and actually what we're doing is reproducing a lot of the same models of that system with new technology. So, for example, in carbon capture and storage, or other forms of greenwashing, and some of which obviously Les has mentioned, and particularly around things like carbon credits, for example, and very much as false solutions. So we've always rooted ourselves within what we call a climate justice framing of economic, social, environmental and political justice as well, because any solution we have has to meet those criteria and not about reproducing the current injustices we have, whether that's for workers in the UK or whether that is for workers globally. So sorry, I just had a message come up there which distracted me, but yeah, so or globally. So these are very real fights that we have in the trade unions, because many of us don't accept the full solutions of carbon capture and storage, for example, and see that as a way of the fossil fuel industry prolonging business as usual. Now, I understand, and I think we all appreciate that trade unions want to protect their workers' jobs, but we are in a reality of climate change. We've seen the horrific impacts of that over this summer particularly, and we know that that is going to continue. It isn't going to abate. It's not a one-off. This is the new future. Unfortunately, we know we need to act very fast, and we don't have time, in our view, for solutions. We need proper solutions that's going to cut greenhouse gas emissions. They have to be worked out with workers as well. We have to tackle the dominance of the fossil fuel corporations in that industry, and I totally agree to break those cross-class alliances with a lot of those corporations. And I think some of you may have seen an article from Gary Smith, who is the General Secretary of the GMB trade union, which is one of the largest industrial trade unions and rooted in the gas industry, which is where they were founded, from the gas plants in Beckton in East London over 100 years ago. And still feel very much tied to that industry. But I think what was quite disturbing about some of the comments made by Gary Smith, and this has been put out by trade unions as well, that, you know, we shouldn't see the fossil fuel corporations in the oil and gas sector, for example, as our enemies. Now, I'm just paraphrasing, that's not a direct quote, and I can find a link to the article if people are interested to see what he wrote. Now, I think one of the things that we always say, regardless in what we think about fossil fuels, if we look at North Sea oil and gas, for example, it has always been a boom and bust industry. It has not had the concerns of workers and citizens at its heart, and therefore there's no reason why we should trust or believe them, and that they will have the future in their hands. And I'm just trying to keep an eye on the clock, but I think this is why for us in PCS, and along with other unions as well, need to believe that we need to be talking about what are our workers' plans for the transition that needs to happen, and how do we want to direct these, and very much not just within the technological transformations, but also within the political economy transformations that we need, and breaking down this hegemony around the neoliberal agenda, that we can have these carbon fixes which won't actually fix the problem. And I think it is with horror that I have actually sat in meetings talking around carbon capture and storage, which obviously they're trying to develop to store under the North Sea, where we can create a market in carbon. So that would be us importing carbon into the UK to bury, so from other countries, which I just find utterly astonishing. But this is where we are, and this is something which we have to tackle. So some of the ways in which we're doing that is obviously aligning with other unions around common agendas. One of those at a global scale is through the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy initiative, where we are trade unions in the UK and across the globe. I think we're now represented on every continent, which is fighting for public ownership and democratic control of energy. And this isn't just because we think public ownership is good, but we think it's because it's the only way we're going to be able to transition the energy sector at the pace and scale needed, but also protecting workers, but not just protecting workers, but dealing with things like fuel poverty and energy poverty, having a proper assessment about what that energy transition means, what it means for every country, not just our own. Obviously, the understanding the issues around the new forms of extractivism and not trying to promote a new colonialism around that extractivism as well, and being very conscious and working that out in a very planned way, which will also deal with the issues of jobs as well and the so-called just transition. And I think I've just finished by saying that many of us believe now that just transition is not a term or phrases we should be used. It's been captured by the corporations and the politicians. It's not a helpful language anymore, and it has very much become a very narrow focus about replacing certain jobs, mainly in oil and gas industry, but prolonging those industries for as long as possible with forms such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, which has been mentioned, and ways of just also within unions within those sectors to prolong jobs in those sectors without looking at the wider transformations that we need. So I'll finish there and happy to hopefully participate in the debate later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I think you raised really important question linked to, what has been the role of like kind of a top-down approach to this, and I think it's very relevant. It comes to my mind all the role of green industrialization that we are now hearing in academia and in the policy sector. So I hope we will have time to discuss this. But without further ado, I let Helena then intervene. Helena Paul, thank you very much. So I think you have slides, so I'll let Craig post your slides, and yes, let's try to keep it to 10 minutes so that we have time to Q&A.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Craig, have you got the slides?
I do indeed. Bear with me one moment.
Sure. Great. Thank you very much. Well, I thought after reading Les's presentation and been thinking about this for a long time to talk a bit about system change and what it might actually mean in quite different ways, perhaps from the previous speaker. So I hope it's going to be complementary. So that is my aim. Next slide, please. Okay, we have this idea of pretending to change, which we've heard a lot about already, while continuing with business as usual. So we have known for 50 years that we have to change, and we're still not doing it. And we have to address the injustice and equality too, between rich and poor, in our countries and around the world, between the global north and south. But we continue to fail to take real action. So as the others have said, we see the creation of carbon credits, carbon markets, carbon offsets, and lots of other market mechanisms, and we're told that these can solve our problems. So a quick example. Les has already mentioned this, but it is a real problem because basically the EU policies did nothing to provide a truly renewable alternative to fossil fuels. So they encourage the development of monoculture tree plantations, which are something that I feel particularly troubled about, to claim carbon offsets and then provide biofuels as an alternative to oil. Those plantations don't often replace natural forests, in fact, and lead to more destruction of biodiversity. They're also in themselves low in biodiversity, as well as frequently being invasive alien species. So they have a very negative effect on the land and resource rights, livelihoods, and food security of local populations, especially in the global south. And the proposals of civil society for reduction in energy use were simply ignored. Can you just scroll down, because I can't see? Thank you. So why was this? Great. The corporate response on emission reductions. We've touched on this so far. But I think the fact is that corporations and many governments are slowly realizing that real reductions in energy and resource use generally can only be achieved through radical system change. And of course, they want to avoid this because they realize that it will greatly reduce their profits and could drive them out of business. Note also how BP and Shell seek to exploit promised fossil fuel alternatives, such as hydrogen, as well as continuing to extract oil and using old oil wells as places to dump CO2. They're also promising offsets, as we've heard before, funding forest conservation and plantations. And they are persuading governments to do the same thing with the encouragement of, for example, the World Bank, which made a big attempt to persuade Liberia to go down this path. So this merely delays the action we so urgently need. And then we're promised techno-fixes, as Les said, meant to address the problems of climate change and biodiversity loss without pain. This continues. And as Les so aptly spoke, one techno-fix is modified slightly or changed into another. And so we go. Next slide, please. So I think a basic problem is that our economic model is based on perpetual growth. You may have heard talks about growth in both the Tory party conference and the Labour Party conference. The trouble is that we really can't continue with this. The problem with economic growth is that it means ever increasing extraction, exploitation and destruction of planetary resources. Whatever people say about fixes of various kinds, it destroys soils, water, mineral, forests and people, and generates ever more waste, as Les was mentioning too. Take agriculture. So we now have proposals to present the worst forms of industrial monoculture agriculture, which with its related food systems is responsible for up to 33% of major climate forcing emissions, CO2 and methane mainly, as a carbon sink, enabling offsets and thus the continuation of such agriculture. This is being promoted in the US. And of course, it provides major profits to many global corporations. Next slide, please. So what we need is actually a paradigm shift. And this can be defined as a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions. And such shifts can be very difficult and slow. So when Copernicus declared that the Earth is not actually the center of the universe, but it's the sun, which of course we have moved on from since then, the Catholic Church responded with absolute fury and defensiveness. And when Galileo tried to defend him, Galileo got into serious trouble with the Inquisition. We need to move, therefore, from our current economic model of economic growth, based on extraction and exploitation of all kinds plus waste. So use more throughout old goods, buy new ones, to a steady state model that involves recycling and reuse, but so much more than that. It requires the rich to take less and the poor to have what they really need. This is a genuine process of contraction and convergence within countries and across the world. And above all, it requires us to respect planetary boundaries, which we have already breached, as accelerating climate change and biodiversity loss clearly show us. So this means that we must collectively reduce our impacts on the planet in an equitable manner, which in turn requires major change. We have to address the size, reach, structure, and rights of corporations. And here are just a few examples of their rights and powers. Corporations, once incorporated as legal persons, have human rights under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948. These enable them to exercise freedom of speech, to advertise and lobby. And they also prevent human persons from bringing cases directly against them for human rights violations. They also have limited liability for their actions, expressed in the term limited. Shareholders only lose their own money and they bear no wider responsibility for damage done. And of course, corporations have undue influence over the state our governments, and us. So how do we address corporate power? Let's look at it. A number of corporations are richer than states. In 2018, 69 of the richest 100 entities on the planet were corporations, not governments. Walmart, Apple, and Shell all accrued more wealth than Russia, Belgium, Sweden. This comes from Global Justice Now. This is totally unacceptable, and we need to act against both corporate power and supportive governments such as the US and the UK. We need to change the structure of the corporation, the role and responsibilities of directors and shareholders, and their relationship with the state, and address the serious issue of corporate impunity. So the consequences are this corporate impunity, which allows directors of corporations knowingly to cause harm to the public in the pursuit of profit, knowing that the corporate form protects them from legal responsibility for their actions. And shareholders, and don't forget, many of us are shareholders through pension funds without even realizing, most of the time, with full knowledge of the harm, can invest without fear of being found legally responsible. Next slide. We also need major change in how we govern ourselves. And I want to ask, is our current system of party democracy serving us well? Especially basically two-party systems like the US and to some extent the UK. And if not, what are the alternatives? And I would put it to you that actually citizen assemblies have great potential. They're composed of anonymous, ordinary citizens meeting regularly with the right to call on specialists for advice, and they are tasked with developing the basis for new policies. In Ireland, the use of citizen assemblies is ongoing, and if the decisions taken are accepted in a referendum, or at least that was certainly the case with the first citizen assembly, the government then has to enact them. And my nearest experience of such an assembly was the UK Synthetic Biology Dialogue, which was fascinating because we saw experts and people promoting solutions faced with a public that had no special knowledge, but a deep instinctive suspicion of what was being pushed at them. And they had a lot of extremely wise suggestions. And yet they were very ordinary people with no particular interest. And I think that's the important thing. And I've simply put a few references at the end, so we don't need to look at that now, but in case they're useful, deeper explorations of corporate structures and so forth. So that is really all that I want to say now, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Helena. And I know your organization published very, very good report. So yes, thanks for sharing some of the references. Thank you, everyone, then, for presenting and for the very complimentary and interesting contributions. We now have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So please, people, raise your hands for questions or put your questions in the chat box. I think there is a lot of food for thoughts coming from the role of civil society to the role of the state, to the role of corporate actions, and many questions. Do I see any questions, immediate question? Otherwise, I can also start with one question. We have a question. Okay. We have a comment. My career experience makes me view Guy as an abused elder. Got a dash to yet another appointment to help a parent. Okay, sorry, thank you.
I was going to speak. I was just going to say my earlier comment on ecocide laws.
Karin.
Do they offer help? Yeah. Do they offer hope?
Thank you. Yeah.
You're talking about ecocide. Should I come in briefly?
Yes, I've got to go.
Ecocide is a really important issue. And of course, I referred to it when I was talking of exceeding planetary boundaries, because that is a form of ecocide. And the thing is that we don't seem to realize most of the time how deeply dependent we are on everything that the planet provides us, and how deeply destructive we are too. So it's very important that ecocide be properly recognized. I completely agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for raising this important question, Catherine. So any other? I can see Catherine hands. Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, I maybe can ask some questions. So I know that this like presentation, and I don't know if I can see Theo. I will just ask quickly my question and then let Theo also ask his question. So it's about like EU policies, which obviously kind of dictate the agenda on, you know, like techno fixes and agro, you know, agro biofuels and GMOs. And I mean, for someone who works on agriculture as well, this is very interesting. And also, you know, the standards imposed on the global south, that also are very important implications. And for me, like the question is actually on what are the implications for the global south. So I know that Les mentioned the Brazilian context and the land grabbing, like the land conflict coming through, you know, these like pressure for the market and demand for biofuels. My question is more related to like an intersectoral approach to industrialization that all the like, you know, low income and middle income countries have. Which is the industrialization. And now there is this wave of green industrialization, and also like you've been mentioning, to build value and clean the gas and oil and fossil fuel kind of global value chain through, you know, hydrogen, but also plastics, for instance. So the processing, you know, and upgrading of those sectors. So I wanted to ask you what is your, I mean, if you could comment on it, and if you have any, opinion, and what is your intake. And then let's collect also a couple of more, like Theo. Hi, Theo.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentations. Very, very interesting arguments. I just wanted to put another more perhaps provocative question. I mean, do we have any reason to be techno-optimists at all? I mean, what about techno-optimism within the alternatives which you have suggested? What about techno-optimism that is more inclusive, more democratic, more techno-optimism that comes from the bottom up, as opposed to techno-optimism that has been coming top down and putting forward imaginaries which have been destructive? So that's my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. So if there is no other like immediate question, maybe we can let them answer these two, and then we move to another round. Yes, please decide who goes first.
Well, perhaps I'll start on those two kinds of questions, I mean, very big questions. So I'll try to be brief. So on the first question about, say, the dominant system, supposedly greening its economy, developing a green economy. I mean, this has a little grain of truth in that there has been a big increase in renewable energy, some of it authentically low carbon, and some of it replacing fossil fuels. But for as long as energy usage continues to increase, which has many drivers, which would be a whole different topic, then the renewable energy won't keep up. So the greening, again, is the renewable energy in that limited sense, can serve as a false solution and play a deceptive political role. And as regards, say, transport technology and systems, I mean, the mirage of second-generation biofuels played a crucial political role in delaying decarbonization of of transport fuel. Now, more than a decade later, finally there was a big push for electric vehicles to replace fossil fuels, which could have been done a decade ago. But that opportunity was politically avoided in order to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry and to supposedly incentivize investment in the so-called bioeconomy, for which biofuels were an ideological symbol. But now that finally we see a push to electric vehicles, that brings a whole new set of environmental problems, because they continue all the environmental harms from the motor vehicle system, except the fossil fuels, to the extent that they are replaced, and introduce extra environmental problems from the rare earth extraction, right, which is being increasingly documented. So that, in the broad scheme of things, is another false solution, and still evades the issue of people's dependence on private transport vis-a-vis the inadequate system of public transport. So that's just one way of answering the question. And then on Theo's question about, say, techno-optimism, I mean, I think it's generally referring to capital-intensive development of future technologies that don't yet exist. As John Kerry put it, you let the cat out of the bag with that quotation. And so I use it as a pejorative term, because if we're talking about alternatives around the concept of social innovation, grassroots innovation, then it doesn't depend on a techno-optimism as regards the future, because it's building on something which already exists to some extent, and which is in the control, or potentially under the control, of collectivities developing it, developing their skills in relation to real use of these systems. They're not dependent on companies and their capital-intensive methods. So, I mean, this characterizes some examples that I gave, agroecological methods, which, say, in Latin America are sometimes called social technologies or socio-environmental technologies, in the sense that I described, emphasizing social meaning, a collective knowledge base, which is developed through knowledge exchange, the concept diálogo de saberes, and the example of materials recycling facilities, whose design is already well known and of course can be improved. And it can also be used as greenwashing to sanitize the continuation of incineration, but it can instead be used as a substitute for incineration. And it can be designed to provide renewable energy to address fuel poverty. It all depends on the socio-technical design of the particular case and the political forces driving it. So in that sense, I think it's better to reserve techno-optimism as a concept for the capital-intensive models and use different terms for, say, socio-technical designs, which to some extent already exist and whose benefits are already demonstrated.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, thanks. Because I mean, from my perspective, the systemic change, thinking of it holistically, the way that Helena put it, I think requires also to be techno-optimistic in many respects. And if you look at movements, there have been lots of techno-optimistic movements, including open source and other movements, which have actually changed the division of labor on the ground. So that's why I put this question. Yeah, I fully agree with you.
Thanks to you. Let Helena and Helena. Sam speak. I don't know if Sam is still with us, but I think Helena is ready to also contribute. So yes, let's go with Helena first. Is that okay, Sam? Yeah.
Is that okay, Sam? Thanks. Well, I think that the problem is sometimes we don't recognize real knowledge. We keep countering our problems with this techno-optimistic point of view, which is adopted both by its opponents and its the people who support it. And so we have the idea that we'll be able to make food in laboratories, and various companies are already doing that. But the point is that Brazil, I want to give Brazil as an example. You have in Brazil the major destruction of biodiversity in order to produce GM crops, GM soya and so forth, that is exported to Europe in huge quantities, although many people may not be aware of this, and imported. We don't import GM food often, but GM animal feed certainly is, and we have intensive livestock breeding. And it's issues like that that have to be tackled, because if you destroy biodiversity and you destroy the land of both the landless movement and the indigenous people, you have to remember that they also have extraordinary knowledge and understanding of crops and of their context in the forests. And this is going to be vital to our future, frankly, because one of the problems about the techno-optimistic approach too is that we have to make a separation between the scientists, certainly in the area of gene technology, promoting alternatives to food. Most of those scientists are being supported by large corporations because the corporations foresee patents and big money to be made. And this means that the techno-optimistic approach is usually infected by this problem. And in fact, we have to remember that the basic knowledge about the environment really, amongst, as I say, indigenous people and small farmers, is massive and must be part of our recovery process. And I think that that's really what I want to say. So we have to be careful of the corporate support and the interaction between the scientists and the corporations on techno-optimism. Thank you.
Do you want to reply on the green industrialization question that I asked or not?
Sorry, on the what?
On the green industrialization, and or it was included in your.
I think yes, green industrialization. I think that is part of it. I have less experience of that and much more of the small farmer issue.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Sam. Yes, please. Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just come back on a few points and hopefully touching a bit on green industrialization, because I think, yeah, and I something I want to say as well, my opening kind of response. I was very pleased to see, Les, that you made this reference to actually how we've reduced our carbon emissions, which was through a deindustrialization process in the 80s and 90s, which of course this government is now claiming credit for, of having the reduced emissions the most, but we know exactly what happened there. And of course I'm predominantly talking about the coal industry and the dash for gas in the North Sea at the time, because I think that's often not brought out enough about what was really going on. And of course, as a labour movement, that very much frames how we see these transformations now and industrialisation. In terms of the green industrialisation, I think there's an interesting point, and which again you've just made, Les, which is about the capital intensiveness of this industrialization process, because one thing which again I don't think we've done enough in the trade union movement is to challenge our counterparts and other unions about the so-called jobs they're chasing in these new technologies, because most of it is actually capital intensive. They're not going to create lots and lots of jobs. I know there's always lots of figures thrown out about jobs, and it's you can determine what a green job is. I mean, there's no agreed what's the word, kind of what we call a green job. Yeah, you can call it many things and decide what's in that category, and of course the language is always shrouded in could create or may create or whatever, because of course a lot of these will probably be jobs that could be created anyway in other industries. But But I think, yeah, there is a lot of false flags there. And the other thing, obviously, around aviation, you know, the whole support in some of the aviation unions for sustainable aviation fuels as being the kind of what's going to decarbonize the industry, rather than actually looking at the nature of aviation and who flies, and the fact that, you know, we need to reduce flying, etc., and of course the big impact on land use of aviation and destruction of that industry. And it's something we do have members in the aviation sector, and it's something which we've been campaigning about for a long time. But I think that's also part of trying to understand what this green industrialization is. But I think as well, and Ellen, you really picked it up on key points, and it's something we come back to in our union, is about knowledge and skills, and who has that knowledge and who owns the right to sort of determine what the future should look like in terms of the transitions we need. And one thing, just to highlight as an example, that we're doing in PCS at the moment is we're working on this idea of a national climate and biodiversity service, sort of based on a model of a national health service, as a kind of institutional framework to actually undertake the transitions we need. But we're developing that internally for a working group of our reps and members who work in the civil service, who obviously have to work day to day on government policy, and saying what we want you to bring to the table is your knowledge as workers within the civil service who oversee these policies, and how could we redesign and develop a proposal for a very radically different civil service that delivers on what we need and as part of a coherent plan. So I think, you know, so for us it's about bringing out the skills and knowledge of workers, and for doing things which are socially useful, as they did with the Lucas Aerospace example back in the 1970s, using those skills and knowledge for socially and ecologically useful production in the broadest sense. And that's where we think innovation should come from, because, and obviously a lot of that will be jobs rich, and thinking around the incineration sector as well. And just as a final point, which it just bemuses me about this whole taxonomy of what is renewable energy, because obviously this has been led from the EU about energy from waste. Nuclear is now part of that whole taxonomy of renewable energy, which of course is another level of the greenwashing. I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're cautious of time, so we're going for the last round of questions, and we have Emily who flagged some. Thank you, Emily. Please, floor is yours. We can't hear you. Yeah, maybe now. Try. No, maybe your headphones. Yeah, or you can like type the question in the meantime. And yeah, maybe you can type the question, or so that at least one, so that yeah, sorry, the usual technological fix. Sometimes I like this is like, yeah, live. In the meantime, yeah, I just wanted to anticipate. Is anyone other than Emily wanted to ask some questions?
Could I, while we're waiting for Emily, could I come back just to kind of postscript to the question that Theo raised? A really good example is how to retrofit houses to provide better insulation and renewable energy together. And in my book in the chapter on Green New Deal agendas, near the end is a case study on Glasgow, where there has been a conflict between two different agendas, illustrating the overall framework of techno-market fix, whereby the long-time neoliberal policy of Glasgow City Council has set up a system of competitive tendering for companies or bidders to supposedly retrofit many houses, and this sets a minimal standard, for what counts as an improvement in such a way as to favor multinational companies which have a standard technology to do so, even though that may be seen as, say, obsolete within a decade as these methods improve. And it excludes all the relevant expertise and knowledge of community groups and trade unionists in that region by hopelessly throwing them into competition with each other. So the housing associations have complained that all our knowledge and our potential cooperation is being excluded by this system of competitive tendering. So the Glasgow TUC within the larger Scottish TUC has counterposed a different system for selecting higher quality proposals, which would provide a higher standard. And this would come from a cooperative process, linking all the kinds of expertise, which can be seen as grassroots innovation or inclusive innovation.
Yeah.
So it illustrates that same conflict.
The question. Yes, sorry. Let me ask. Yes, that's also a very good example of, again, market-based fixes. So Emily has typed the question. One is about public ownership of energy. She asked, what about allocation of funding here? For instance, if you promote solar in richer areas where they could have promoted energy from waste in a big down, and also do we have time for local scale energy projects? I know you should optimize cost because it might be harder to do local project if or when central government projects don't work, but still, how much time do we have really? Okay, can we have literally 5 minutes or 2 minutes each? Do you want to try to give an answer to Emily to these 2 questions? Thank you.
The crucial issue is distribution networks, which have been
obscured. Let me, you start, then okay. Go ahead.
Crucial issue is energy distribution networks, an issue which has been obscured by all these wonderful proposals for increasing renewable energy, because otherwise they aren't connected in any effective way to the grid or to any local distribution system. This has been a big political conflict in many places, especially in some German cities. And even the proposal of the Labour Party now, it isn't clear. Does this mean a state-owned distribution network or merely production? I finished there.
You're done. Wow, you're very efficient. Then Helena, and then Sam. Is that okay? Yeah. And I know that you raised your hand.
No, I just want to say that all these comments really bring me back to the point that I wanted to make, which is that I really think that we have to tackle corporate structures, because I really do not think that we're going to make any progress otherwise. We've seen the same trajectory over and over again, with the corporations taking over these projects for their own interests and jigging them, rejigging them, talking to government, which of course is also so deeply corrupted by lobbying and so forth. And I just fear that unless we can somehow be really radical, we'll just carry on tweaking at the edges and not really dealing with it. And I'd be interested to know what people feel about government, because I just feel so strongly that, especially in a time of party political conferences, I beg their pardons, that we are really stuck with the same system over and over and over again. And I don't know how we can escape it without challenging those parties and saying, we want a different form of government. The UK government did try a citizen assembly once, but of course it had no authority. And I think that the Irish were very courageous in doing citizen assembly, and they aren't the only ones that had real authority, and it achieved real breakthroughs. And I don't think that we can carry on tweaking at the edges. We have to really go for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, corporate regulation is really, yeah, a huge part of it and responsibility. Sam, we have a couple of minutes for you to, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and be quick because there's a lot to say about energy. This is about central planning. I know it's not a popular word or two words, but this isn't about localized energy projects per se, because yeah, that's fine, but in a well-heeled middle-class area, having solar projects doesn't mean that everybody can have those. So it's about how we plan the energy system overall and to make sure there is justice for everybody as well. I mean, I've got huge skepticism around Labour Party policies. They're not, GB Energy is not about a publicly owned energy. That is a vehicle to leverage private sector investment and to set up some of the supply chains around that. So I totally agree. I think the issue of growth and those words productivity as well, which are normally thrown in alongside it, have to be challenged. We have to challenge those within the trade union movement. Certainly we do within my own trade union, and people are alive to that. So we do need to radically change the system. And I just say, finally, because if we don't, we'll see what's happening now in renewable energy in offshore wind, because the corporations are trying to make it profitable and recreate it within the same way as the fossil fuel sector. And that's one reason why we argue for public ownership, and whether that's the fossil fuel assets or renewable energy assets as well, but with democratic control. So there is democratic inputs into that. So it's not just a centralized top-down Whitehall government framework, for example. I'm finished.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I guess lots of people in the chat box are also thanking you guys for this discussion. I think, I mean, we kind of started to visualize both the problems and the answers, but yeah, at least we won't change the system with this seminar, but we hopefully contribute to, you know, amplify the issue and raise the voice and advocate for some sort of changes. So I thank you very much, all the speakers, and Les, we hope to see you again and continue this discussion with